right, here we are. It's Monday.
Just the two of us.
We
You can make it if you try.
Oh, that's smooth. So we're here Monday afternoon. We didn't record on Saturday as we had planned. Angus had some strenuous work. Very skilled carpentry.
He overdid it in the garden.
He overdid it in the garden. So here we are, and we're ready to fly. We didn't even prepare beforehand, and we're just going to hit record and let it rip because we've been thinking and working on this for a little bit. We're going to grab one of the better contemporary thinkers in this space. I would say he's, in my estimation, she is in my estimation up there with the other integral and postmodernists or metamodernists who transcends those labels in many ways, like Zach Stein and Daniel Schmachtenberger and Vervaeke to some extent, Bonnita Roy. And she's a lovely person, clearly has a great sense of humor and brings really a humanness to her approach, and what she calls a fierce naturalism, which we will take down as appropriately needs to be taken down. But that's sort of clickbait language, right? We're going to destroy her. No, deep respect for her work and for Brendan Dempsey and his inquisitive mind and his ability to have his mind informed and changed. As he mentioned, I think he had a conversation with Zach Stein previous to Bonnie's maybe a year ago, and clearly Zach had an effect on the way he thought about complexity and the way we're organized, essentially. And so they have a conversation here, and it really is to find out what Bonnie thinks about her worldview and about purpose and what's going on within evolution and that sort of thing. And one of the things I'm interested in, and Angus as well, is to place anthroposophy alongside of these movements that are arising now in spades, and they're very significant. I would say, in that they're symptomatic of a need of the time, and I think that they almost get to where anthroposophy starts, and where one can find fulfillment in a narrative that is connected to reality and not connected to simulation. So that's my feeling coming out of watching this, specifically, and then generally how we're treating these analysis of people in this space doing good work.
That's a great introduction. Thanks, Jeff. I'm going to also add my own personal take, because I'm not as familiar with Bonnita Roy and this whole integral movement as perhaps Jeff is. I've been wading in there a little bit. And listening to this conversation was really interesting to see how sophisticated some of this thinking is, but at the same time, how confused it appears to me as a novice coming in. And I think I'm going to try and unpick that. Okay. Yeah,
so,
cool.
Okay.
So, yeah, I'll just explain what I said. I said how valuable their questions were, but they will start they will be the point at which we start to try and create clarity. So I'm going to do a big cross there so I can see that's more or less where we are. More or less where we stop. Okay, so launching into the video. We're going to watch 3 minutes where they're starting to get into meaty bits of the conversation, where they're talking about an apparent teleology, and then Jeff and I are going to try and unpick this a little bit. Does that sound good to you, Jeff? Okay, yep. Let's have a go. Can I control it from here? No, I have to control it from here, don't I? Okay, Let's go.
Nothing will have changed, so
Yeah.
it's probably not worth going into that. But I am curious, what would you make? What do you make of teleology?
That's a good question. Okay, so when I stumbled upon Wilbur's work, I was writing a big, huge philosophy of my own called telos. And it was justifying here's the cut, the apparent teleology of the universe. Okay. So it was very sophisticated. I don't even think I have, because the hard copies anymore. And I didn't have a PC at the time. IBM Selectric.
So you mean there's a lost work of Bonnie Roy?
Yeah. So that's an interesting question, because it throws me back to like this initial impulse before I knew anything about Eastern philosophy, and then when I met Wilbur, like this whole other kind of psychoactive work and understanding some of the perennial problems from an Eastern viewpoint kind of terminated that project. I would say there is, and I think the interesting project is to explain the apparent teleology of the world, in the same way that Carl Friston said the mind can be looked at as if it's a predictive processor. And so it doesn't mean this is real. It's just useful. So I would say today, if I had to make a statement, like my life depended upon it, that I don't adhere to teleology the way people have a strong teleology, but I think there's an inherent intelligence in the universe, which is certainly non-trivial, and which means everything holds together. That's the best way. It's not going somewhere, but it's completely coherent and integrated and intelligent all the time. And I just say the Tao is not broken. You look out, and no matter how bad life gets, I don't believe the Tao is broken, but I don't believe.
Okay. So, who's going to launch off there? Jeff, do you want to, or shall I? I can't actually hear you, but I saw your hand gesture. It looked like it was me.
Go ahead.
Okay. One of the questions that we're going to probably come back to multiple times, or certainly definitely there's a later part in this, this use of the word real, because it becomes really problematic throughout this whole video here. We're talking about this guy who she refers to, who says teleology is not real. Is it a simulation? Is it artificial? So I just wanted to flag that point. Another way we're going to notice the problems that they run into, and these are problems that anybody who talks about these type of things will run into, and which we've joked about, like the koan-like nature of statements. When you try to make these statements, we're making statements about one side of reality, but perhaps not clear about which side of reality it is. And this can, to an outside listener that's not informed, sound like it's contradictory, as opposed to describing the whole spectrum of the field we're talking about. And for those that might be following with the astronomy course that we're currently doing with the Urphenomen channel with Matt, there's a very deep tie-in with this idea of reciprocal systems, this other side that often gets forgotten or is even claimed to not exist. And that's what they're doing in this other side. They're saying there is no direction. They're saying there's only an apparent direction. And Jeff and I, we are of a fundamentally different opinion on that. We are spiritual beings evolving in consciousness and greater freedom. It is really as simple as that. From an anthroposophical point of view, then you would need to get into like the whole justification. But there is a teleology, and we don't need to phrase it in an apparent teleology or this type of thing. There is purpose in life. Life has a goal, and so that's one of the things I wanted to emphasize there. So Bonnita, Bonnie, he calls her Bonnie, that's why I said it. Bonnie Roy, she says, we're not going anywhere. We are, is our answer, isn't it, really? There.
Yeah, the problem here is that she's so close, but her starting point is where inevitably she self-contradicts on just about every point that she makes. She ends up self-contradicting.
Yeah.
And I'll lay that out a little bit from her fierce naturalism standpoint, right? And so she's respected in these circles because she's grounded in evolution as a narrative, right? And so are we, but we have a different picture of that evolution. So the naturalists that she represents, and that she gets even under, because she does a sort of meta move in that she's excellent at problematizing the assumptions within the bubble of naturalism, right?
Yeah.
But it is within the bubble, and she exists within that paradigmatic bubble. She wants out. All the way through, she's describing a way out, and in the end, we'll see that she makes a Fichtean move, which is not a move out at all, actually. Although it is a peering across the threshold to some extent. So, you nailed it when you said what we understand from an epistemological standpoint is that we are spiritual beings having physical experiences, not physical beings having spiritual experiences, and that is not as if, as she mentions, that as the pragmatists approach things, it's not even as if the mind is a mental processor, whatever the mind is, because it's not clear what she means by the mind. She uses it in terminology that the terminology of a pure concept or a pure abstract concept, when she's actually she wants to use it that way, but she's actually self-contradicting and using it as a categorical abstract, which we'll see when we
see that later. Yeah.
So she's self-contradicting in the way she's using mind and mental and mutation. So she leans heavily on this idea of mutation. Now, I'm not arguing against the concept of mutation, but as the generator function within evolution, it is one hell of a presumption to make. That is based on the narrative that is a belief system, and so a simulation. And so when we get to simulation, we can see what she's doing is creating a simulation or participating in a simulation that she's calling real. And I think this addresses what you're saying. And I'll say the final thing is that what we've won through our work together with Matt and the Earth Phenomena group, and through Riddles of Philosophy and Philosophy of Freedom and the dovetail reading, including Kant and Hegel and Fichte, and not just Steiner, but Steiner's unique epistemological approach. What we've won is that evolution, the evolution of consciousness, is an evolution of the complex nature of being that runs throughout the universe, that is not reducible to a complexification process occurring from simple cell to complex human epiphenomenological reality, so-called reality, right? We're sort of, as we've mentioned, outgas or a result or a product of evolution, that we're intimately involved in evolution because we are self-conscious beings.
Yeah.
And we're becoming increasingly involved in that process. And so that, to me, helps to, and we can unpack a lot of this, and we will, but that helps to differentiate the way I at least feel in relationship to, and it's super helpful to have Bonnie lay it out there in the fierce naturalist way, because the dividing lines and the self-contradictions are so clear that, for me anyway, they're so clear that it really helps to say, here's where anthroposophy fits in with the same language, or perhaps not exactly the same language, but parallel uses of language, but in a way that you don't have to be an academic and cite these middling academics that they're always citing, that you were actually drawing from Fichte and Hegel and Steiner and Goethe and Aristotle and Plato. We're not drawing from Carl Fursten, right?
Yeah.
And his as-if pragmatic nature of the mental processing mind.
Yeah, good. You mentioned something really interesting there, which I think it's worth stressing. This idea, this reliance on mutation, it's evidence of their Darwinism 1.0 as opposed to 2.0, which we've elaborated on in other places and which we might end up getting to here as well. But it's like an inevitable. They have to lie on this random mutation, because if they didn't, there would be a teleology. It's they have to use that word, otherwise there would be self-contradiction within their own argument. So in that sense, they're being consistent. So you can certainly give them that. But one of the things that will come up a little bit later as well, if we've got it covered, but I'll mention it now, is Brendan talking about agency coming in here. And this is where our big thing is. And so there's an agent doing this change. Mutation is there's no agent, there's chance, which is no explanation. It's not an explanation. There is no explanation. As I've said before in other videos, so like the communist word for God is chance. That's it. That's it. We can't accept there's a God, so we'll call it chance. But what do I mean by agency? Just as a little feel that if we get something like the placebo effect, it's like well-documented medical phenomena where you give people sugar pills and you change the size of the drug, you change the mode of delivery and everything like that, it changes. So like that, the person's reaction changes to the whatever ailment it is that they have. Just so like really honing in on placebo effect, that's agency. That's mind changing contact. That's the wine and bread of communion. And this is what they either don't want to or cannot accept. But again, it's a natural part of an anthroposophical way of thinking. So I think it was good, really good that you honed in on that mutations there, Jeff.
Yeah,
Did you want to come back on something?
I think you really nailed when you brought in wine and bread. I also think of the turning of water into wine. In other words, turning the through and the placebo effect as descriptions of that agency. Those are only some descriptions. We also know that we affect brain development. And if that's not an evolutionary factor, I don't know what is. And we're developing organs of perception, right? So we found that with Fichte and the development of the organ of the eye.
Yeah. And
so I want to go back just very briefly to the wine idea. That the idea is that we through our perceptions we affect the molecular structure of existence, say something like that. That's one way to put it, right? And I don't think there's any doubt about that. Like, I don't think if you made that statement in a scientific circle where people were actually scientists rather than followers of science, they would say yes. This sort of the observer definitely affects the observer is the least of it. Of course, what we're talking about is something quite different and quite larger responsibility. I'm tempted to go further right now, but I think I'll leave that there because we could just talk right now about everything that we're going to end up talking about. Though I will say that I was listening to a series of lectures by Dennis Klosek called The Etheric Heart. And in the first lecture, he really describes how he really pulls together how evolution actually works as relates to spiritual beings, a complex of spiritual beings. So what I want to say about this complexity thing that they keep coming back to, and the directionality they give in what they call the vertical stack. Never mind that there's a horizontal and a front back.
The hierarchical complexity.
And it's all recursive. None of it is iterative. Only our technologies are iterative, and our models are iterative. So, but anyway, he brings in what's going on in this. So yes, so to get back to this point about complexity, the problem with their version of complexity is that the existence is complexifying, and that we are an example of how the sort of on top of that stack from bottom up that occurs. And I would say that it's more plausible that existence already is complex and it's ever evolving, and we emerge out of the complexity, and because we're complex, it reflects the complexity that exists. That it's more like that directionality wise. And that is equally, even from their own point of view, that's equally plausible. Yet they don't consider it. And we'll find out why, which has to do with thinking.
Interesting you bring in Dennis Klosek there. I'm also tempted to bring in also just a little bit of name dropping and idea dropping, but Steiner's referenced Novalis's magical idealism sort of multiple times, and this is this idea of using ideals, the creation of ideas, to shape reality, how it is our the concepts that live within us, and the creativity that comes from the depths, if we're going to use Jungian terms, the creativity that comes from the depths, and it's bam, you've got this is a new way of structuring an organization or a society or my life or something like this. And this ties in so deeply to the second half of the philosophy of freedom, because that's what there's trying to awaken consciousness of our active nature in the creation of these ideals that then become that which creates our morals and there's structures in our society. There is when the Earth was created, and we won't even put a date on it because we've got no idea, and I'm certainly not going to go with the traditional model on it. There wasn't any society. All society came about by human beings getting together, having a think about things. That's saying, let's do it like that. There's no natural order in them. There's no natural order. There is in the animal kingdom, and there perhaps was earlier in the human kingdom to a certain extent. But if we look at societies, these are thoughts that have been turned into outward manifestations, and this is one way of understanding what magical idealism a la Novalis is, and this is at the heart of where we are we experience ourselves as on one side of the debate, and they are. I think they could buy into the ideas that we just said, but it doesn't form an integral part of their structure. That's my understanding of it.
It's because they're not integral enough.
Good point. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
They're not incorporative enough of all of the phenomenological realities associated with what it is to be a human being. Yeah. And they've already decided that it's a single cell organism complexifying into moi, right? Yeah. And though that is part of the incarnative process, it's not the origin of the incarnative process. The incarnative process is before the embodiment, And so this is what Klosek gets into very, very well. And with him, you get well, I've just listened to the first lecture, so I like to approach things as if I haven't seen or engaged with them before, and I haven't this lecture series, and I know him well enough that his Goethean and alchemical approach is very incorporative of every bit of natural science that has produced something from its midst, the most cutting edge things, from neurology to embryology. And of course, he goes into both of those things, and he goes into also iterative algorithm output and recursive algorithm output. And the best thinkers like Schmachtenberger and Forrest Landry are able to have this conversation with us in this way, because they're abutting. They're at the edge of themselves as relates to what it is to be a human being, and so there's a humility that allows for the thinking to shine through, except that they think they know what thinking is. They take it for granted, right? And until it's examined, then this is what they seem to be all allergic to, is until it's examined, you don't realize. I mean, I thought I knew.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But I just keep discovering that I had no idea what.
It's an ever deepening process, isn't it?
What the role it plays universally as the organizing principle. Period.
Yeah.
And
that's why it makes it so easy to look at what these guys are saying. So say, yeah, good. Oh, whoa, huge error, which is so important that it becomes the model that they're describing falls apart, even though many elements, we're going to look at one in a second, of what they're describing is true to nature. It is like the product of science, but there isn't a center holding it together.
There's no being, right? And I get that, because I'm trained in contemporary. I'm part of the evolutionary process. My consciousness is thoroughly a self-absorbed self-consciousness. It's the thing that everybody has, that we're walking around with. I am of my age, very much so. There's no question about any of that. Like, that's true. Yet, my what I'm willing to consider has altered, because I'm coming closer in my relationship to reality as a being peopled, meaning using that term loosely, but as a self or complex multiplicity of sort of selves in a certain sense. And I don't mean the abstract self that she ends up with or that Fichte ends up with. I mean beings, some which do physically incarnate like us, and some that are neighboring us that don't.
Yeah.
And that we are part of this complex of being. And I'm coming closer to that through this work. And I see them moving farther away from it. The notion of being, other than behavior and the agential or the agentic or these terms, which are thinking in words, as Bonnie says we shouldn't be doing. But, right? And courage is a being. Courage is not a story about Odysseus. Right? The story of Odysseus was inspired by the being of courage, say something like that. And it's much more, to me, plausible to come into relationship with Bonnie's thinking, and I'm including her in this presumptively, I guess presumptuously, that she would be more comfortable with the biomarkers when she's working with concepts, if she came into relationship with courage as a outgrowth of being. Beings, I should say, multiple beings.
One of the things that I really like in the next thing that we're going to see that they do is, and we've talked about this, about building real concepts around it, what the etheric adds, what the astral adds, and what the I adds. And when we're going to listen to them describing a little bit this this stack, a stack of complexity, which I think is really useful because if you haven't reflected on like how amazingly different we as human beings are from animals, she's going to start with bees if I've got the timing right. It's easy to miss actually how we are way, way, way beyond these beings. So in that sense, I think that there's a huge service there, bringing science in and saying, hey guys, we're not just special, we are amazingly special. And to feel how that is, it's like through the descriptions that she gives, I think is a useful part of the conversation. So I'm going to play that now. It's like it's a 2-minute clip where they're talking about the stack of complex, or stack of simulation is what they call it. Anyway, here goes.
Spiritual, human life has a vertical dimension. But most people say vertical and they think it means up. That's like saying horizontal and think it means left, right? So this vertical dimension is always the whole stack. And what I know, and okay, now I just realized here comes the weeds.
Nice.
Okay. So there's a vertical stack, and let's call them mutations, right? So let's look at one interesting mutation. There's many, there's morphological mutations, there's genetic mutations, there are all kinds. But let's look at one more interesting mutation, and that is that at a certain level in the stack, which is talking about life, we're not going to go that far down. So we don't get that far in the weeds. At a certain level in life, there's only sensory motor feedback. The world and the organism are so beautifully coupled, right? And whenever we talk about these levels, there's always organisms that we don't know where to put them. Language has to categorize them one way. Is a virus alive or it's dead? Well, it's neither. So I just want to say that this kind of conversation is coarse-grained. But then at a certain level in an organism, two things happen. One is the organism can simulate its environment. And so the first thing that happens is the organism can simulate its environment. And what comes along with this, curiously, is what I call pure abstractions. So a honeybee doing his dance waggle to say where the honey is talking about the way the parallax in the sun, in the sky, at a certain time of day, you're going to orient relative to that, and you're going to go so far. That's a pure abstraction, right? And so the honeybee.
Okay, so we're not going to listen to the whole, all the different levels that she delineates in there. We're just going to mention in brief so that people can go back and watch the video. She then goes on to develop how not only can we simulate the environment like the bees do with their dance, but we simulate a self, and we can have a shared simulation, and we can have a virtual simulation, and she maps those out there. And in that, what she's pointing to is like this ever-increasing ability that we have to develop an inner life. Okay, and this is really interesting to live with this idea. First of all, the amazingness that a bee, so like that, what is it within a bee that's like will get it to map its environment so that it can communicate? Where is that intelligence? And then with the human being, so this awareness of self that happens to us often, so like between 1 to 3, 4 years of age, it's like an initial waking up of being. And then her picture is when for shared simulation is where you and I could imagine performing a certain job. So we can map it out in an invisible space, and we can be imagining it and treating it as a temporary reality, so that we can solve a problem in what people normally call reality, either physical world. And I think it's really good to reflect on that. What did you think about when she was when they brought up this whole simulation thing? I know you had quite a strong reaction to it.
Yeah, well, she's running a simulation and she doesn't know it, and she's saying this is the way in which she's so close, because she says, I'm tempted to take it another direction, but I'm not going to. She says that the problem with sort of modernism and postmodernism, say, and much of the iterations within, say, the meta-modern movement and the integral movement, is that, and she says meditators are doing it. Many meditators are doing it as well. Is that they're running a simulation and they don't know it. And I contend what she's doing is running a simulation and she doesn't know it, except that she knows that you're not supposed to run simulations as reality, right? But what she's calling reality is what we alluded to earlier. She already has what she's calling first of all, we have a problem here, Houston. Where you passed behind the abstract moon when you said that a bee makes a pure abstraction. Mm-hmm. So a bee does not make a pure abstraction. That would be a cognitive move, and bees don't do cognition, right? They're part of the organizing principle of existence, right? Human beings do cognition, and you have to have self-consciousness to do cognition. Yeah. Right. Like I've heard people describe, there's a point at which, say, chimpanzees are socialized, and that one of the aspects of their mental life is that they share with us is that they recognize, they want to be recognized. Well, that already suggests that they have a self-conscious knowing as something that they want to acquire for themselves. Mm-hmm. Not just that they want to be recognized, but that the idea of recognition itself as an act of cognition would be something that they would be performing, right? And I think it's a fundamental mistake that she's making that precludes her ability to step out of the simulation that she's running, and then she just abstractly, I would say, makes categorical abstractions out of potentially pure concepts. Mm-hmm. Right? Some of those, red is real. For example, I'll dispute that. I'll take that one out. Red is real. There are beings that stand behind that
perception,
epigenesis that is color, mm-hmm. and then goes away. It comes and goes away. It's both iterative and recursive with its environment. Red is I would say real. The way she uses it, she's correct. It's a categorical abstraction. Now, maybe we need to explain the difference because we haven't gotten there yet, but she describes categorical abstractions as empty concepts, essentially what Steiner would call empty concepts. She calls pure abstractions what Steiner would call pure reasoning, pure thinking, or pure concepts, transparent concepts. Transparent because they're showing us the world. They're not something we believe in. Rightly, she's saying this rightly. She says we fucked up when we started using thoughts to think with, as opposed to coming into intimate relationship with the actual reality. But the actual reality is being oriented. I'd like to reiterate that. Yeah. So these are some of the first bits of thinking I have. Is that what is as soon as you use mutation as a categorical abstraction, you're running a simulation. But you're saying it's the real agency that's moving evolution. Yeah, I'm sorry, but you just can't have it both ways. You're not going to be believable at that point if even though you're believable in so many other ways within the mm-hmm. bubble, but you're running a simulation, and so it is similar to reality.
Yeah,
it's right, but it's moving away from the nature of being.
Further reflection on what I think you made a really good point there about cognition's not happening in a bee. So one of the questions that's like, okay, so if that's not cognition, what is it? We're not saying there's not intelligence in the bee that's guiding its instincts. In actual fact, that's exactly what we think is going on. But it's not a bee actively cognizing. So like, there's the sun. So like, I'm going to do my mathematics, and I'm going to wiggle my bum in a certain direction so that I can communicate. This is all instinctual. Knowledge has nothing to do with instinct. It's the polar opposite. It's instinct is intelligence that is not aware of itself.
It's also instinct that's not disconnected from the rest of nature as we are. I mean, you described this this very special place that we have as profoundly, uniquely complex beings that we've established can't be reduced to a linear complexifying product. But we're also not better off than bees, like freedom's a bitch, right? Because the simulation we have to run, and we do need to run the simulation. We agree with her on this.
Yes,
that the theoretical, the development of the self as a real emergence out of our relationship with the complexity of the full reality these are very important moments. But if you're doing the epistemology and you're tracing it you're tracing your thinking from the observation of that which you observed, which includes observations that aren't connected to a physical body sensory experience. That's part of what itself is.
Yep.
It's not reducible to a physicality, just as thinking isn't reduced to physicality. So this idea that we're running a simulation is crucial. It's really important that she's getting at this, phenomenologically speaking.
Yeah.
But the presumption of cause about why that's happening, or how that's happening, or that it's happening without the freedom that she describes that we're moving toward, right?
Yeah.
But she has no basis for that freedom. There's no. I mean, I'd love to hear if she does, but I don't know how she can get there without really understanding what thinking's role is in relationship to the development of concepts, the development of self, and the development of the simulative process that allows us to reconnect with some sort of higher order from our instinctual self.
Yeah. I think it might be useful to unpack a little bit what you were saying about how the simulation we buy into that. But in our language, one of the ways we might describe that is the necessity of creating a provisional self. It's this awareness. It's like the provisional self. I can map that to simulation, but exactly just saying we've got a totally different like ontology from which that has sprung, which is completely different from the integralists here. And just to map that out, it is we could use the idea of even the word person or persona. Person comes from the Greek. It's like to sound through. It's like the idea of the mask, or we could take Jungian psychology as well. It's this is the ego. It is something of value. It's far from the whole being. It's far. It's a million miles away, but it's still necessary for waking up of our own spiritual essence. So we need this. They would call simulation. We need this provisional self. We need this ego in psychoanalysis. It has a very important role, and I'm sure we'll come back to that when she when she makes some sort of very strange statements about thinking itself, that in a certain way you can agree with her, but if she doesn't map out how that this fits into a greater narrative, it becomes a purely ridiculous statement. But we'll come to that a little bit later. I think it's about the 50-minute mark. Yeah, I did like her point about like the stack goes sort of up and down. So really, it's like creating this idea that it's like it's not a unidirectional. It's like it's what she's doing there. I think she helps us. It's like connect. So like to the extent that we act intelligently, instinctively, we could say, using her model, it's like we're acting like bees, and we do that as well as human beings. That's part of it's like how we begin to function in life. We're purely instinctively, and then this cognitive process, it's like gradually wakes up, which goes way beyond animal being or what a bee is capable of.
Yeah, the evolutionary picture which we are dealing with is not contradictory to the evolutionary picture that she's operating out of. It fills in all of the gaps with the organizing principle that's actually at work. On the other hand, the evolutionary picture that we provide would be described as fantasy, I think, or something like that. I'm not quite sure. It's interesting that okay, I'm not going to go there because it's not relevant.
Yeah, go on, go in.
I'll get there.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, like so the agency that's alive is available now to us, right? And so our way in is where we are, not going back to some. I mean, Big Bang, for example. Greg Henriquez does this move. The Big Bang, right now, the Big Bang is completely under dispute now. So where's your starting point then? Why do you need a fictional starting point at all? Your starting point is in this ontogenesis that's going on all the time, right? Yeah. It is developmentally related to evolutionary processes. So, and we'll get to this probably as well, because she makes this hard distinction between sort of teleology and determinism on one hand, and she makes, or chaos, I don't know which, which is sort of which is its own kind of determinism, I guess. And she makes the hard distinction between evolutionary processes and developmental processes, which you can't do. You can do it, but you're precluding the mediating factor between the two, right? And you're occluding your own perception of the way in which human beings are intimately tied to evolution. And I understand from her point of view and from a fierce naturalist or a naturalist point of view, we sound absurd. They don't sound absurd to me. They sound perfectly rational, except they're missing some key links.
Yeah, I'd like to really hone in on one thing, because you brought up the Big Bang. It's really interesting. I want to look at this from two angles. When we think about like how Kant tried to overcome dogmatic philosophy, failed, but Steiner achieves it. And so in his the true epistemology in the theory of science and truth and science, and then the philosophy of freedom. What they're doing is they're stuck. They're trying to get back to this original principle, this metaphysical truth, which then permeates. And in that sense, they are truly old school. There's this heart that's like in the distant past is the truth, and if we knew that, then we would know everything. Steiner makes this move in the philosophy of freedom, well, not move, it's like it's a statement. He says archaeology really started to make progress when it started, instead of invoking catastrophism, to describe, it said it started at the top layer of the earth and then it started moving downwards. So start now, guys. Don't start your process 13.7 million years ago or whatever the latest date is, because you've got a load of models which is what you were talking to, Jeff. There's so many flaws in them that you can have very little confidence other than the authority of science. But you scrape a little bit on the veneer of that. It's like redshift. Okay, is that sort of like conclusive that the universe is expanding at an ever greater velocity? According to loads of scientists, yes, and then according to others who can reason very soundly, I said no, that it doesn't. And you have to get into the weeds a little bit to understand that. But the problem they're making here is they're saying this is an absolute truth, and it ain't. If you want absolute truth, start with something that's here and now. And in that sense, when they're looking at the simulation stack, they're talking about something that we can recognize as real. Okay, we have problems with their interpretation, but at least they're starting with the here and now scientific evidence. And then what models can we use what conceptual frameworks can we use to bring them into a complete picture. It's like the whole picture of nature that we'll talk about. So when Bonnita asks, it's like a really good and important question a little bit later on. So yeah, I really thank you for bringing that with Big Bang, because I think it accentuates a severe shortcoming in their thinking. Taking something as gospel, they are taking as gospel. That's a religious belief they've got there. They would not accept us saying that. That's fine, but it is, because unless you can argue against all the arguments that competent scientists are making about why we should be careful about, I'm just taking one example, redshift, and there are multiple others, then it's gospel. That's all it is to you guys.
That's right.
Unfortunately, you do not realize this.
That's right. And I say this humbly. I agree with you humbly, and I've said it in a different way, and I mean this humbly, because I'm not as smart as they are. I'm not as educated. I'm not as exposed to the academic research that's occurred in these fields within the bubble of materialistic science.
Yeah.
And call it what you will, it is a duck. It does quack. It does have webbed feet. It does have subcutaneous fat that's delicious. We've
got a chef talking here.
As Dennis Klosek says, it's the motion, not the meat.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So the human heart, for example, it's about the process of the human heart that makes it a spiritual organ. The physical nature is spiritual. It's not matter. But we're defaulting into materialism when we describe what she describes as relates to this vertical stack, and she makes the right distinction. She says, the spiritual bypassers essentially will take only the vertical. We're only going up, man.
Yeah.
And in a certain sense, the idealists did a similar thing, Hegel and Fichte particularly. But at the same time, if you're really talking about a recursive or reciprocal relational universe that we're talking about, then it's also not, you don't go down lower and say it's down here, but it's only going in a certain sense up in a complexifying way. You can't do that. It's simultaneously there's a communication going on in reciprocity. It's relational, and the mediating factor is me. It's you, and it's all the individuals who are taking up cognition consciously and are making the alterations in the evolutionary process. And we have been participants since the beginning in that evolutionary process. I will make that claim, right? So they're making a claim, I'll make a claim that we were always here. We weren't as we are now. We've evolved, but we didn't evolve from single cell organisms, and we did. Right? So as physical beings, we were embryos, right?
Yeah.
But as spiritual beings, we chose our parents. I'm making that claim.
Yeah.
And that is the kind of agency that results in evolutionary processes. And we have to take up our developmental bed and walk in order to be a contributor to the creative harmonies of the universe, as opposed to a degrading, self-destructive force that's affecting evolution in that way.
Yeah.
So abstract thought is going to change molecular structure through scientism and technocracy, whereas intimacy of thought is going to affect evolution in ways that are in harmony with the way in which the totality of existence works through a multiplicity of beings in relationship.
Adding a little bit more sauce to your wonderful description there. So they say we simulate a self. What is doing the simulating? Come on, guys. What's doing the simulating? We have an answer to that. We have a true self. It creates a provisional self, which sort of like, yeah, we don't need to go into that. But come on, guys, give us an answer. What is creating this simulated self? A simulation of a simulation. We're beginning to sound like these philosophers that Steiner describes in Riddles of Philosophy. They're creating these metaphysical realities like that are impossible to. They exclude the possibility of ever being able to find them, but they're using them as a justification for their models. It's like they're building castles on air, as we've talked about in multiple occasions.
Oh yeah, they're doing the Munchausian, holding themselves up by their pigtail. But I want to challenge them, like talk to us, because what I get in even the best of them is and I think Bonnita is the best of them. Like she's really subtle and supple in her thinking, and she's really in trying to engage in a spiritual reality, and is by virtue of the spiritual nature of her thinking.
Yeah.
Right. It's there. It's clearly there. But I want to challenge and say, look, it's not a club, right? We don't believe the linear direction that you're describing evolution to take, and that it is moving in a direction like that, and there's reciprocity in out of the space-time continuum, working always within this soup to bring this duck soup into full flavor, into fullness, into a harmony with the senses, right? Including the developing senses that don't yet exist, and the ones that are cusps and on their cusps of existence. Don't disregard this narrative. We have a different narrative, and it's equally plausible, even within your framework. It's equally plausible if you pull in like quantum physics and such, right? Yeah. Which I don't need to do, because I'm not trying to prove it, right? It's not an abstract argument I'm making. It's an experience of a self-creative being, just like everybody else is. Right? We have the desire to be gods because we have an inkling of it. That's what the inklings were about, I would say.
I'd like you introduce the whole conversation today, but I'd like to share a thought, because I was. You've honed in on Bonnie Wright is like very switched on, and for a while I was confused because she takes on this teaching role for Brendan. You get the idea that she's sort of like she's sort of like somehow perhaps testing her, because she has this couple of times she demonstrates like a teacher-pupil relationship to him in there, and several times I was wondering, is she it's like being a good teacher in sort of like drawing the person to the limit so that they sort of like can sort of like realize, oh shit, yeah, I need a new model, or I need to think differently about this. So there was part of me thinking, actually, she really, her smart. I'm not debating her smartness. She's quite clearly smart. It's her clarity of thought that I was sort of like, I couldn't make up my mind about, but having reflected on it, as we're going to demonstrate also further, I actually think that there are some quite substantial areas of confusion in what is, it's like, nevertheless, it's like a really switched on smart mind. So yeah, I thought about leading in with that, so I wanted to share that now, because yeah, it took me a little while to wake up to what was going on there. And it could be if perhaps she really was taking on a teacher role there, even with her last really like deep questions that she looks at. However, I watched another video where I suspect she was asking the same question, and there I also said like that. No, I think this is a genuine question that she has. She's not putting it out there as a teacher, and she hasn't found a resolution to it yet. And I think we get that to when we start looking at yeah, the 66 minute mark, so like the second to last snippet that we're going to look at. So yeah, okay, so next one. This is where let's watch the clip. It's a 2-minute clip, and yeah, either you and I can take it from there. Oh, you can't see this, can you?
No.
Can you hear it?
Mm-mm.
Ah, okay. Sorry.
It's okay.
Hold on. Right, I forgot to press the tab. Okay, it should work now. Let me know if it doesn't, Jeff, okay?
May be destructive. So the fact that you have these powers by themselves does not mean the kind of mind you have today is incoherent with the nature of mind,
Yeah.
which is your teleology, which we'll talk about later, that I'm not right on the same page. And this is the problem that I think everyone makes. So for example, that the kind of simulation we have goes into AI doesn't mean it's the next mutation. It could be just the fucked up way this mutation is going right now. And so the nature of mind and the mutation is one thing, and then the kinds of minds we have today is another thing. And I actually argue that that when people started thinking with thoughts, that was in the wrong direction.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Right?
I'd love to hear that
Yeah.
unpacked a bit.
And this is, of course, what was happening in the Axial Age. You know, Socrates was like, oh, you know, I have well, I can make this abstraction. So in the real world, for example, in the mythologies and the early allegories, you know, the god was both an asshole and a warrior and a rapist and a hero all at the same time. You get to the Axial Age and you can make these abstractions that goodness is a thing into itself. Courage is a thing into itself. And you somehow get the impression that they exist as real things. And this kind of, it tidied things up. You don't have to wonder why, you know, Odysseus is an asshole and a hero at the same time, because we're not working with Odysseus. We're working with courage, knowledge, virtue. This is fucked up. This is what Whitehead would say is the problem, because those things are reified. And
Okay. That's fucked up, man.
She's right.
She's right there. Who's going to launch?
You.
Okay, Bonnie. If you're not going to think with thoughts, what are you going to think with? I mean, this is... She's chucking the baby out with the bathwater. There are... thoughts have their limitations. Think so, mental representations and all that type of thing. We're not... There's no dispute there. But if you are going to not think with thoughts, the words don't even make sense. And I think she's making one of the thoughts that it sent me off. One of the thought directions it sent me off in is one positive way of understanding what she was trying to say, but sort of like minced the words, in my opinion, really badly. Was this idea of someone like Nicholas of Cusa talked about learned ignorance, and it's an idea that Steiner develops like quite thoroughly as well. This idea that we've talked about, for example, with the provisional self, is that we go and divide the world up into like concepts. And those concepts actually, as you were saying before, it's like reflect the real being that's behind them. There is a being that creates the colors. There is a being that creates like the different, like all the different concepts that exist in the world, so like smoothness, flatness, blah, 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 blah. But we then have a second job, and that's how we like bring these all together. We've chopped up the world into concepts, and then but we've had to create those concepts. They have been it's like an individuating process within ourselves. We recognize how we are distinct in the world and how certain elements in the world are distinct. So that chopping up process is healthy because from our perspective, because that's part of the freedom. There's nothing that obliges you to create these concepts. It's like there's a desire, there's a yearning within it's like every being to understand the world a little bit better. This is like chapter 2 of Philosophy of Freedom. But then you have to go beyond the chopping up, and you have to bring it back together. But if you haven't done the chopping up, you can't bring it back together. It's just this whole given mishmash where you don't understand anything, where you're a bee dancing full of intelligence, but you've got no idea what you're doing or why you're doing it. And that's where we as human beings are fundamentally different. So I really think she slipped up badly. If that's what she was trying to intimate, then I'm fully on board with her, because there is a truth in what she's saying. There is a limitation with thoughts, but she doesn't then go on to describe how this is useful in the long run. And again, that's like an essential part of what we're trying to communicate, is that this limited thinking that she's talking about ultimately serves a teleological, it has a higher purpose. There is a reason why we're doing this. And so it fits into a model. One more other thing before I pass over to you, Jeff, is when she's talking about the axial age, I think she's talking about Jean Gebser, because Gebser is very important in the integral theory movement, or they might use different names, I'm not sure, because he's Mr. Evolution of consciousness. It's like in that world, and axial age, I believe, is one of those terms that he uses as like in his own particular like mapping out of how consciousness evolves. And this is something that we are absolutely, we buy into it. This is part of the teleological process. It's not apparent. It's not apparent teleology. It's real consciousness. And Brendan, he has a wonderful question later on related to this, where we have a satisfying answer. And if you don't have a teleology, you can't. It's like, no, it's just happening because mutations. But we'll come to that later. So I said a few things there. Would you like to say anything else or build on anything else?
Yeah, I want to revisit this notion of teleology too, in order to sort of recouch it within the terms that I believe reflect reality, and that is that nature is not teleological as we know it. We as human beings, as part of nature, are purpose driven or drawn. Hard to say.
Yeah,
probably drawn, purpose drawn, and as such, the nature of reality is teleological. Pull humans out of it, then it abstractly, as theoretically, it wouldn't exist, right? But that doesn't mean that the human teleology is a abstraction glommed onto nature. It means that nature's purpose was always there, inherent in the seed of what humanity is becoming, and beyond humanity, perhaps one could say. Not in a transhumanist sense that we mean now, which is symptomatic of, I think, a wisdom that is bleeding through into across the blood-brain barrier, something like that. And coming out as leaky gut syndrome or something, I don't know. But these are all sort of symptoms of as illness of the health that is the wholeness of existence that we are part of, and we can't abstract ourselves out of it, except operationally. We're in the place where we have to, in order to realize these potentials, and part of that purpose is to realize a self that is still only in potential, right? That is seeking to bridge that divide, right? And so we know this. This is what cognition is for. It's for us to operate in order to separate and then reconfigure. And as I mentioned in number 5 of 6 of our truth and knowledge conversation, that the self exists by virtue of thinking. Purpose exists by virtue of thinking. Concepts, as utilized by the self in cognition purposefully, exist by virtue of thinking. But cognition is, and the self that exists within cognition is the free agency that can incorporate thinking or doesn't have to.
Yeah.
It can spin off into a simulation, and this is what she's talking about. So she's right about the thinking in thoughts, or thinking with thoughts, only as an intellectual description of reality, which is a version of the postulate becoming permanent, or the provisional becoming the model, which is the model that is the map that, instead of living in the territory, these sorts of things. All of this language is familiar to these folks, right?
Yeah.
And if we have thinking that is the agency that exists within cognition, but it is the agency is not the right word, I don't think. It's the reality that's alive in cognition, but it is us as individuals that are self-creating beings that are present in thinking, exist by virtue of thinking, and everything exists by the virtue of something. Everything is real by virtue of something, right?
And it is that thinking, if she understood it really at a deeper level, it is that which will reconnect us with nature. We will experience directly how we live in nature? This is the question that she asks, I think, sincerely in this video, in another video, and we'll unpack it when we get to that particular clip. But the things you were talking so passionately about thinking, I think it's important to. What does is it Gregor Enrique says, sort of foreshadow, or they use that word?
It affords this or it affords that. So
Yeah, I think so, but I heard them sort of when they talk in conversation, foreshadowing. So like we're floating a concept. It's like priming, you know. Like, we're going to be talking more about this later, so we have to mention it now, type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
There was another thought whilst you were talking there about thinking, which I think is also interesting to reflect on with it's like this Wilbur and beyond society inspired community of people that are trying to like grapple with subjects that academics are still too scared to even tackle. I mean, this is where we have to just like give them recognize the value of what they're bringing to the conversation. They're raising the level of the conversation within, so like in a more academic field, and we're like liberated from that, so we're like more at liberty to like say, well, hey guys, what you're saying doesn't stack up. They can't. I don't think they can afford to do that. They would make too many enemies within the community. It might be one of the reasons we never actually get to speak to these people. Who knows?
Well, I would say that the move they are not allowed to make in the church of their existence, the exoteric church of their existence, is to call in question the fundamental operating agencies within the narrative of evolution. They're not like, if you do that, then you're a creationist or you're a loony or you're a woo-woo or all of this sort of thing. And I think Bonnie has the mind to question all of that. I think they're all getting closer to questioning the nature of those assumptions. Yeah. And again, as I mentioned, I think she's genuinely confused because she's running the simulation and she's using terms like mutation as categorical abstractions, and she thinks that they're pure abstractions.
So I actually went a little bit off point when I started referencing Wilbur and like that inspired community. One of the things that I do think is interesting is I have heard, and if I'm wrong on this, somebody correct me, but Wilbur like says basically at the heart of his thinking is Aurobindo, Gebser, and Steiner, although he never elaborates on Steiner. Now, in terms of teleology, seeing as you brought us back there, when we look at Aurobindo, he is also talking about an inevitable teleology. He talks about moving from mind to supermind, which is similar to what I just described. It's not the same, but it's similar in a way to what Kuza was mapping out. So like this provisional stage to reach a higher stage, like a conscious freedom, a conscious cognition of the world, of the mind of God, if you like. So what I find interesting in this community is how it's like two of the thinkers that are supposedly at the root of them are saying, spirit is there, guys. There is a teleology. They can't go there. I don't know. You might, but does Gebser, does he even tackle it's like this teleology, or is he just like mapping out the territory with like different colors?
I don't know. I'm not familiar enough with Gebser to say. Yeah.
No. That would be interesting. Yeah, perhaps we'll do a follow up on Gebser. We did talk about that, didn't we?
People can comment. I mean, I would love to hear how Gebser maps on, and how Gebser actually would be oriented towards Steiner.
Yeah. And there's another. He's living. He's. I think he was born 1905, wasn't he? And he's Swiss as well. I mean, being Swiss and growing up in that part of the Basel, which is not far from Dornach. If you're somebody interested in like pushing the boundaries of theory, which Gebser clearly is, then it's not too wild a thought to think that he's actually come into contact with Steiner's like theory of most like ideas on the evolution of consciousness. And seeing as I'm actually currently doing like a deep dive into Jung at the moment, of course he was in the same environment as well. Switzerland was a hotbed for interesting people at the turn of the 20th century.
Well, I think we see with our contemporaries the way in which they're allergic to Steiner, why people would have been allergic to Steiner then. It's not understandable. But I would say this, that this is a relevant part of this conversation. It's relevant to the subject matter we're dealing with, because there's no good reason for anthroposophy and Steiner's work to not have a seat at the integral, the postmodern table. Anybody who's willing to do the epistemological lifting and to question the truncated ontology that is the Western canon, not the Western canon, but the Western narrative, the dualistic, dichotomous, self-contradictory, and ultimately self-sabotaging Western narrative. Anybody willing to make that, whether it's Douglas Murray as a politically motivated reasoner who's really brilliant dude who wrote War on the West, as I've alluded to, he doesn't quite get to the epistemological basis of his argument because he's politically motivated in his reasoning, but he's an excellent thinker. All of these people should be incorporating the work of Rudolf Steiner in their unless they're afraid of something. Political correctness on one hand, spiritual not being taken seriously by the academics, physics envy, any of that sort of stuff. But Albert Schweitzer wasn't afraid of associating himself with Steiner. Wassily Kandinsky was not afraid of associating with Steiner. Various poets and artists and practitioners of scientific fields were not afraid, right? So why would Wilbur be? Because is he giving away too much credit? Is he not giving enough credit to some of the origin of his ideas? I don't know. Zach would know better than I do, and he's in relationship with him. So I don't know the answer to the question, but the ignorance is bordering now on a problem of responsibility to actually get at the answer to these deep, abiding questions. When this really occurred to me in listening to Klosek's first lecture in this 7-lecture series on the heart. It's a workshop at the Consciousness Studies in Fair Oaks in 2018. That he describes it. So here's an anthroposophical picture: the psychospiritual organization of the human being. That has to be part of the interdisciplinary approach to epistemology and all of the sciences. It has to be. Klosek brings this idea out of the work of multiple works of Steiner, that there's a problem in evolutionary process that Bonnie is describing here, I would say. That is between the I, the spiritual I, the ineffable self, and the consciousness soul. There is a wedge that's been placed by sort of regressive spiritual forces, say something like that. That wedge is a fixed mental picture that is materialistic.
Yeah.
And it manifests itself in hardened and abstract materialism performed through various institutions, scientific, social institutions, education, all of it. That it can't help but do so. And that the human heart is actually the process-oriented organ of perception for seeing the way in which things come into being and dissolve, and that its work it's currently doing it, and our work is to take it up and to start to work with this mental picture and break it apart and reform it, and break it apart and reform it, and in doing so, we develop the free imaginal process for cognition that all of these people that we have so much respect for and seem to willfully ignore Steiner would have the answer to if they had this psycho-spiritual picture. So I'd like to offer that. And I think it's a phenomenologically describable one, right? That between my I and its agency within my soul, my consciousness soul and my intellectual soul, stands this picture that occludes the possibility of the freedom it would take to get at these questions. So that's another run at this.
Yeah, and the type of questions that these two, that Brendan and Bonnie are asking here, are evidence that it's like there are people that it's like really they're close. So like they're pushing the limits, and we're trying to encourage them to like take a more serious look at Steiner, and you might actually go, wow, yeah, this is coherent. This. It's like, whereas I had to have this like contradictory, it's like impossible to explain without concept inflation, like picture of the human being, which ends up not making sense anyway. There's actually a resolution to this. It's there. They talk about Ptolemy and Copernicus. They're waiting for a Copernican moment for this higher complexity. Do you remember that bit in there? He said they talk about like how Ptolemy had to explain the retrograde motion of the planets, and Copernicus came along, put the sun at the center, and said, "Bada, we got it." And in that sense, they're right. It's like that conceptual simplicity, okay? Because we know there are problems with that as well, which we're looking at with Matt's group currently, but. They're looking for that Copernican moment. They don't realize it's already happened. That's what we're saying, isn't it?
This is what I like about the Frederick Amrein's translation of the interdisciplinary astronomy, because he uses terms like paradigmatic, right? And so what Brendan is called for in this orthogonal move, so to speak.
Yes.
Is a paradigmatic shift, but and what we've been describing is you can't have the paradigmatic shift unless it's a shift of consciousness that is epistemologically sound and relating to reality, just as the bee is conforming, not simulating to reality, is conforming to reality. We simulate to conform to reality. This is where Aristotle was trying to go with his conformity theory. I do believe in its full complexity. It wasn't intellectual exercise. It was a Platonic understanding. Of watching that which comes into being and dissolving, coming into being and dissolving. That there's a ontogenesis that is it's available as that top layer of the geological strata. And it peers into the unity of existence.
I'm not going to go there, but that's so rich that Plato and Aristotle, they're not opposites, as they're often perceived. And you were hinting at there. We're going to have to leave that there, as an open question, but deeply fascinating what you're talking about. Okay, so next one. Where are we? We're at this is where she goes a little bit back to this abstract and pure. What are the terms she uses? Abstractions. Just check my notes. Pure abstraction versus categorical abstractions. That's the bit we're going to listen to now. I'll remember to press the button first. Okay, so let's have a listen to Bonnie.
That you're in the right direction, and if you push further, you'll be somewhere really special. Okay.
Nice.
So there's abstractions that are mental objects, and then there are pure abstractions. Remember I said that the bee can do a pure abstraction. And pure abstraction is what we want to train our minds to do. And so this is pretty cognitively heavy, but I think you're fine because you're already onto it. So those things are mental objects. I think we understand that when you look at virtue, and then we understand the story I told. Okay, now when we look at abstractions, we need to understand two things. So this is just Bonnie being what I teach on a regular basis. So I'm just kind of peacocking it or whatever. But this is fun. Okay,
Peacock away. Yeah,
so Hartshorne, peacocking, yeah. So Hartshorne made a big contribution to metaphysics by talking about what I'm going to call, he didn't call it this, but I'm going to call categorical abstractions, right? Categorical abstractions are like virtue. But that's too hard to understand. Categorical abstractions, this is not how he talked about it, but this is an easy way to understand it. It's like the color red, okay? I can literally see red. It's just a perception, but I can never see just red. I can only see red things. So red is an abstraction that doesn't exist. It only exists in instantiations, okay? And so that's a categorical abstraction. That's what virtue is. It doesn't exist. Of course, Plotinus and Plato ideals, this is the move they made. But what it is
okay. So, color red. The color red doesn't exist.
Virtue doesn't exist, and virtue doesn't exist.
And virtue doesn't exist.
Yeah.
What do you think she's really trying to say? Because quite clearly, the senses contradict what she's saying. Red does exist. I know there are certain scientists who would say, no, you're just seeing sort of like frequencies and blah, 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 blah. But again, this is something we've looked at in philosophy of freedom and also in truth and science, that you can't use, you can't destroy naive realism by using naive realism as your basis for like the destruction of naive realism. I think this is where she's getting confused. She's not seeing what red is. She's saying it doesn't exist, but it does. So what do you think she should be saying there, Jeff?
Well, she's trying to get at something. I don't think there's any doubt about it. That she's right and she's wrong, and she's dead wrong and virtuously right. But the problem, so it meets, it's dichotomous and it's self-contradictory, because virtue does exist, right? The self exists. These are subjective realities. These are qualities. Red is a quality. Mm-hmm. Qualities exist. The need to suggest that they don't, it sabotages our argument. You don't even have to say any of that, right? There are ways to use every possible concept as she describes it, categorical abstraction. But there's a way to use every true concept as a pure concept or a pure abstraction. It's how you use how you utilize the concept that matters, right? It's not that there's no such thing as virtue. Virtue arises out of moral imagination. And moral imagination arises in relationship to the epistemological process that has purpose and a observation of reality associated with it, because it's in harmony with reality that the imagination of what needs to be done is done. And that is a virtuous reality. It's what Deleuze calls virtuating reality. There's a whole ontological realm that virtuates reality. So it's just not a very good use of the concepts, and it's self-contradictory in the use of the concepts, because she's picking and choosing what is real, and leaving out what is not leaving out what is real that is subjective or qualitative. And that's the
Exactly.
move that they keep the mistake. It's a recapitulating of the mistakes that she would criticize.
Yeah. And I want to build, you've nailed it. And I want to like build and add some more language around that. There's a book, Man or Matter, by Ernst Lehrs. And one of the more famous statements in his book, which he might have taken from somewhere else, but that I remember reading, is science is a one-eyed black and white project that with a ruler. And what is he trying to say with that? He says, if you look at the materialistic worldview, it believes that everything is reducible down to, it's like the bouncing around of atoms. Yeah, that's the one, exactly. And this is the inevitable route that somebody who is a materialist has to fall in, and they will turn around and qualities do not exist then, or at least they are not real. That is the fundamental sort of like materialist perspective, that anything beyond what I can measure with a ruler and I can weigh with a machine, that's not real. And red is as you correctly point out, is a quality. Matter doesn't have it. Quality isn't inherent to matter. It's something that the human being, according to their worldview, has invented. And we have the fundamentally opposite perspective that no, red is it is a being, or you could use the word, it's like the concept of red is a being. And when it's shining in my microphone, it's there, type of thing. So instead of negating our experience and saying they don't really exist, which is essentially what Bonnie is doing here, our models like they are still real. And this is exactly what thinking has done. I've taken this big picture. You've got like in the video frame there, you can see there's loads of things going on. I've got a picture there, got Angus here, got a ceiling up there, lights are like a little bit brighter there. Oh, what's that? Oh, that's strange. Oh, what can I call that? Oh yeah, I'll call that the color red. It exists. And my mind has sort of like, out of the whole picture of the given, I've picked out a detail, and that corresponds to something that is real, really real. Bonnie, she uses it is really real. Now, this is where we have to fundamentally disagree with. It's like where the epistemological like platform that they stand on. This is real. You say it's not real. I do. And so this is we could state that in another way. We go Aristotelian. Quantity is not the only category in the universe. There is quality, and there are another 8 as well, which I won't list. But they are categories. They are real.
Even for Aristotle, both were each other. They were in mutual interpenetration, and so it's a known reality, say in physics, that enough quantity results in a quality, and enough qualities result in a quantity. So that sort of thing. That's a really superficial way to describe what Aristotle's describing in his 10 categories about quanta and qualia, or qualia. What she's trying to do, though, is I don't want to totally eviscerate her on this point. It is the way in which she's self-contradictory. There's no question about it, and it is a kind of self-sabotage in the end, as relates to the reality of the self that she's trying to get at. And she does a beautiful move with this circle and the pure abstraction as the center of the circle that exists nowhere, right, but is still everywhere. Right. And it's the invisible reality, say. And that points to something, just like Fichte pointed to something across the threshold. And she has a strong, passionate, I would say, relationship with this concept. But the center of the circle isn't the self. And she makes that leap a pure abstraction into this, that the self is then at the ground of all existence. This is what she says. Now, I don't know if she does it in this video, but she does it with Greg Enriquez. And it's a very powerful argument that is also based in this use of concepts that are really categorical abstractions that she treats as reality. And so she doesn't get to the reality that thinking is that center of the and to be sure, it's a thinking self, it's a thinking being, say, that beings are generating reality. And we, as we know, generate reality with our thinking. Like there's no way around that. Like you can't even if you don't accept thinking as that which we call human thinking existing as organizing principle in all of the universe, even if you don't accept that, which is my claim at least, even if you don't accept that, you can't deny that thinking creates reality. Even if you think it's a simulation of reality. Do you think the simulation of reality that people are walking around with their VR glasses on, or goggles on, are not affecting reality? Like, Of course it is. Yeah, but it is seamlessly so in every dimension of life, and that which is probably exoteric to life or exogenous to life.
I'm glad you brought in the circle there, just like to describe, because I can't remember whether we see this part of the video, but Bonnita draws a black circle on a piece of paper, and so there's no center, but she says, like, we all know there's a center, it's there and it's not there. And this is one of these things that she says where I think, does she get it or doesn't she get it? Because when she talks about it like that, it's fully coherent. Absolutely. She was describing beautifully the koan-like nature of trying to describe it is both there and not there at the same time. But she doesn't see how that is true for color. So to what extent she has been responsible for drawing out of the givens, like it wouldn't exist for her if with her thinking she hadn't drawn it out of like the totality of what's in her visual field. So I think this is one of those crunch points where I really thought, supporting your argument that she seems to get it, but then she says another statement which I think, no, perhaps she doesn't. It's a strange experience. Oh, it was for me. If I'd own that statement more completely.
Yeah. Well, this really describes why we're doing this, right?
Yeah.
To me, because it's so close, it's so adjacent to, and I want to challenge anthroposophers. Look, right? These people, like, this is happening, right in our conversational space, and finding ways to engage with it helps to bring, at least for me, helps to bring me closer to the true nature of things. I think does a service, at the very least, generally speaking, in a consciousness of those who are engaging in these questions. At the very least, there has to be things considered that weren't considered before.
Yeah.
Even if one doesn't admit it, right?
Okay, I'm gonna look at the next video, and the buzzword in this video is causal manifold. Okay, challenge to the readers: can you find an alternative word to causal manifold? We'll try and give one afterwards. Okay. Hold on, I need to getting my control buttons.
Just formal. Then you get into finding systems in which those formal relationships are embedded. And then you can get into higher. So basically what you're doing is this recursive thing in which abstractions are sort of being related to one another in more and more ways. But what I want to get to is that you use this idea of like this causal manifold. And I like the way that Daniel Gortz talks about sort of paradigmatic thought, which is like it's topological. Like you can see it's sort of like, you know, you can see how if you extend, it's almost like a Einstein, fabric of space-time sort of thing, right? Where it's sort of like, if this goes up, then you'll see this thing will dynamically move in this direction. And it's sort of, there's a causal relationship between these complex host of abstractions that have themselves an abstract relational property or set of characteristics about them. And so what I'm intrigued by the idea is what you're naming as pure abstraction, where you're sort of peering into this causal manifold at, like behind reality, so to speak, is actually getting at that very high paradigmatic or cross-paradigmatic level in which actually all those abstractions find their multiple relationships, and they're, that's what's behind reality. That is like everything that I do is related to these things in this way. But when you can see those things kind of directly, so to speak, right, you kind of get this intuitive appreciation for these profound sets of relations that happen across scales. Is any of this making sense, or is this?
But okay, so what's happening is, again, there's more than one thing happening. So let's see if we can separate it. So it's not so like much. Okay, so
I think I'm going to actually stop it there because I think it was his question that is really on target here. Her answer isn't like very satisfying. Shall I launch in, or would you like to?
Go ahead.
So what he's saying here is that these complex pure abstractions that he's talking about, what are they? Oh yeah, they're all of these concepts that are real. Okay, they're not. They are these beings. And what Brendan there is like saying, it's like, yeah, but if this, what's this process? As we go higher up in this complexity level, we start to see how they interconnect these to like these pure abstractions. He's doing exactly that process that we were talking about half an hour ago. It's like we've got the fruit of the intellect, chop, 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 abstraction of the world. And now we're beginning to piece back the world together. And he's asking Bonnie to like say, what is going on here? How does this relate to the causal manifold? And I think the causal manifold in religious times, it would have been called God. That's what they're looking for. Or alternatively, right back to the beginning of the conversation, they're asking what's the teleology of this going on. So he's saying, or the way I'm reading him, listening to him, understanding him, is he's saying, but there must be a teleology, because we see all the added value. He then goes on to talk about agential power, the ability to like affect life at ever higher levels. As we begin to like reconnect all of these pure abstractions into a more complete picture of reality. So yeah, there's one more point that I want to make, which is a little bit separate to that. Got more to do with our astronomy course, which so if you'd like to comment on that complex of pure abstractions, causal manifold, or something else that you saw.
Yeah, I really do, and it's really occurring to me now. These guys are so. Brendan's question is brilliant and wonderful, and he clearly watched John Vervaeke and Zach Stein get into the divine human double. And Zach took John right up out of this intellectual abstractions into the way in which these beings are communicating with each other. Mm-hmm. They're in dialogue, just like you and I are in dialogue, right? So if the concept is real, the concept is having conversations with other concepts. Now that sounds absurd from an abstract intellectual standpoint, but it's only absurd from a categorical abstraction. Okay, so you did two things there. One is you're describing the psychological, spiritual process of say, the epistemological process of coming into relationship with reality. that has to do with the complexity of our conceptual framework, right? And so Bonnie earlier makes a revealing statement or a revealing reference when she brings in Christopher Alexander, who is the author of Pattern Language, right? And it's the idea that it's an intellectual idea of pattern recognition. Right?
Was that holons and fractals where they were talking about that, or
I probably,
Okay.
but specific to this part of the conversation, we're talking about a psychospiritual operation that's going on as related to a causal manifold. Okay, so hold that, because that's there. That's wonderful. And then there's the actual ontological reality that's being dealt with and its activity. And so what we're coming to know is a complex, a hierarchical world of spiritual beings, right? And so what we would have called God, the Catholic Church cut off, starting with the Council of Nicaea and the separation of the spirit out of the soul, physical, and then also the move abstraction away from the ground of being multiplicity of hierarchical beings, known as the spiritual hierarchy. So what we're talking about is a recognition in patterns of spiritual beings who are in communication with each other, and we're joining the conversation, something like that, right?
Wonderful
Yes.
image.
And
Beautiful.
we're being invited to, because we're spiritual beings. So we're it's what Klosek says, is they have no skin in the game anymore. They're like we are like, and we've all had this dream, right? Or this fear, say, that for me it's always sports related, but for some people who are artistically bent, it might be like a play, and they're called upon to play their part, but they've only been in the audience, but all the beings have left the stage, and now it's your turn, and you have to read the script, but you don't have a script. And it's something like that, like we are unprepared to play in the game, and we're being called on because all the players have left the floor, and now we have to play the game against a very complex organizational schema that's working against us, right?
Yeah.
So I think this picture is good because it describes the reality that we are spiritual beings in a spiritual universe of beings that have a role to play that is unique to being human and not other spiritual beings. And this causal manifold it's an intellectual and psychological description of the reality. That's why as he mentions, the intuition flashes forth, because you know it's real. That's why she talks about concepts and biomarkers. You know when a concept is not real or when it's empty, because you can feel it. Not because you're, as she says, not because your body is your mind, whatever she means by mind, because we haven't established that. That's a categorical abstraction. Mind, mental, mindedness. These are all presumptive.
I wonder if just on that mind thing, I am guessing somewhat that she is like more as like out a window, which is a recognition of like the inferior state of the mind in relation to this super mind that has like the complete, like the overviews, like in anthroposophical terms, it would be direct communication with the spiritual world, which doesn't mean so like everything becomes explicable, but it means you can actually begin to research in the spiritual world. It's like spiritual facts become accessible to you that were not accessible when you just thought with the intellect.
Yes. And she's just thinking with the intellect. So the mindedness is an accepted notion now within the stack, the vertical stack in complexity theory. Mindedness is like, there's a point at which there's mindedness in organisms, and that's a complexifying process. So that's the way she means mind, as I understand it, which is a categorical abstraction, because it doesn't deal with with mind at the level of thinking. It just does not, and nowhere does.
It's the product of thinking. It's not thinking itself.
It is, yes, right. It's the house that thinking constructs that we live in, and yes. So,
it's like as Steiner says, those people that use thinking to undermine thinking. No, if you're going to criticize thinking, the last thing you can do is actually use thinking to justify it. It unfortunately it is that simple, but yeah.
Yeah, I forget where I was going exactly, but
sorry, I jumped in there.
Okay.
I couldn't resist.
Right. Oh, that needs to be talked about. We need to talk about this notion of mindedness in mind, because it's exactly where the starting point is, not some sort of presumed fictional starting point that can be applied out onto the world.
Yeah.
Right, because it's with this complex causal manifold that we're participating in the provisional self, in the simulation that we see through, and then that gives us the world, again, because the world is rich with mutuality of being that we are participating in when we do it. But we don't have to do it, because we've set ourselves up at this point where we can just live within the simulation and exit reality to some extent. And I would suggest that's the thing that is the existential risk of human self-extinction. That's the so-called driver.
Good point. Rather than, he said something about space-time there, which is hugely problematic. He was using it as proof of like a paradigmatic change, so like for explaining gravity. But again, this is a little bit like this Big Bang, and I'll try to give a very, very brief overview as to why. It's like intuitively you can feel there's something very strange going on there. So you've got this idea with space-time fabrics, like sun in the middle, heavy object. It's like everything going down. This model is supposed to explain gravity. It doesn't explain gravity. It's doing. It's like saying, if we think about gravity like this, then it looks reasonable, but that doesn't explain gravity, because there's nothing that's sort of like forcing that planet on the edge. If there wasn't gravity there, it wouldn't be forced into the middle. It reflects the lack of ability to critically engage, and I'm guilty of this type of thing as well, so I'm not like painting myself as somebody who knows it all. But again, we've got like supposed truths about the Big Bang and space-time going on here as if they are absolute points of certainty. They are not, and they often creep into these types of conversations because people have latched onto the idea of like how science talks about how they are revolutionary, and to a certain extent justifiably so. But unless you engage fully with these concepts, you don't realize it's like what are the mental shortcuts they take? Where is their thinking not consequential? Where do they like skip a step in their thinking to allow them to retain that thought? And this is what Steiner does also. It's like time and time and again in philosophy of reason. He said, let's rethink that thought process, doesn't he? He does it multiple times, and it's like says, you know what, guys, you missed something really important here. And if you missed out on that thing, or if you take that seriously, what you just says, this completely changes the nature of the conclusions that you arrived at. So we've got another example of that going on in this conversation.
And she describes that process the process by which we go wrong.
Yeah.
Right. She understands, like she really gets like a part of it. That where things are going wrong, how things are going wrong, partially.
Yeah. Okay, let's look at the next segment. There we go. Oh, yeah. Okay, I got it turned on. So
until I saw the videos late in life, I didn't know that's what it was. Like it's really talking about something real. Okay. So the problem is that people can get very, very high and complex abstractions around abstractions and not have any idea if it's tethered to the real, because those are two different skill sets to manipulate abstractions and to see what they mean.
Mm-hmm.
And the second skill set is what we would call truly a metacognitive move, not just higher and higher cognitive complexity, but it somehow cuts through something. And this is when great science happens. Like the whole edifice is just cut through by, like, Max Planck. He saw all these terms in all this physics, and he's like, well, how are they related? You see, the very intuition to ask that question is really the pure abstraction. The rest is, the labor you have to do to suss it out. So my question, okay, and then there's another thing, and I just, because I'm doing this course with Illich, one of the things he said about modernity is that, and this is true for all cultures, that there's always, as things get more and more complex and build on themselves, there's less and less opportunity to include what has been left out. And so you're basically building more and more complexity, and eventually the malware, the mistake at the beginning, will become the huge problem at the end, because it's grown iteratively.
That's what we were just talking about.
Wonderful piece.
We were just talking about that. I forgot that's how she did it. Exactly. That was it, right?
Yeah. So, what is really real in our world, Jeff? What is really real?
Being.
And how do we know what is really real?
We experience it self-consciously and transparently and cognitively.
Yeah. And adding to that, what is really real? This is one of the parts of the conversations with Viveki Enriquez and Zach Stein that I really enjoyed. The importance of reality. It's having the model that does describe reality. So in Steiner's terms, it's like mapping first of all, creating the concepts within ourselves, intuiting the correct concepts, seeing them outside in the world, and recognizing that experiencing those concepts as reality, as opposed to just something that is conceptually that lives in our conceptual space. We see it manifest out there. So the really real, from that perspective, becomes the same concepts that shape reality, which are not given to us through perception. We create them in ourselves, and then we see our own creations manifest in reality. And if our concepts are the same being that created what is outside in the external world, or not just, it can be in the interior world as well, but in the world of experience, then that is really real. Often really real is presented as just being what's available to the senses. We know that to be nonsense, because you can't say anything about the world without thinking. So I think that's one of the things I really wanted to highlight here. That really real is an important concept to come to grips with. But there again, we see a fundamental divergence between how they seem to see it is what is available to the senses, as opposed to it's the meeting of conceptual truths in ourselves that are also existent in the perception and us making that connection, which is a fundamentally different relationship to one which they have. What they are saying is half a truth. They haven't recognized their own selves in what real reality is, what really is.
And how human beings work iteratively against reality. This is a nice word that she uses, and it's a really important one in relationship to that which we create, which is destructive, something like that, that has dead ends associated with it, that is a dead end and works back against us, say, in some way. And I would argue that with her in this case, that she's using the wrong word when she says that this iterative process results in us getting farther and farther away from what is really real, that it's a complicating process. And it's complicating because we're building abstractions upon abstractions, categorical abstractions upon categorical abstractions, postulates and simulations and models and theories that are believed to be really real at some point, or we forget that they're not, that they're theories, that we forget that they're simulations, which she's doing, I would argue, that result in a what do you say? How would you say it? Like there's a complication of reality, or a something that mirrors complexification, like complification or something along those lines, something that is like more and more surface fragments that are funhouse mirrors of each other's fragments that look complex but are just complicated, right? And so that is the iterative process that she's talking about, and it's built on models, theories, abstract concepts that have no relationship with reality, because we don't believe concepts are real, even though we have to have them and we have to operate with them, and we treat them as if they're not, and so they become this part of the simulation. Except they're an involuntary part of the simulation. Not only do we forget it, we involuntarily throw them up, right? And that then is the reality that we're at, the matrix out of which we're out of. We sort of become the prisoners of our own making, and the jailers and wardens of those prisons.
Yeah,
sort of a spiritual gulag archipelago.
I do like this image she brings up. So like complexity, so like the malware has been, so like if it's there at the beginning of the theory. And it's like you go through this complexification, it's still there at the end, but it's like it's become even more potent in its malignancy.
You've become less able and subtle in your processes to handle the complex nature of reality, because you've become superficially complicated the matter with all of these veils over it, all of these self-created, obscuring, occluding, self-fragmenting scrim or debris.
I think the malware that I think the malware is the dogmatic rather than relative position with regards to materialism. That's the malware. We're not saying material science doesn't have an important role to play in an understanding of the world. But if you make that sort of like the departure point for your theory of knowledge, as Bonnie would say, you're fucked. Or you fucked up.
Yeah. And you're fucking everybody else with it too. Like and this is a good point to bring in, that she has this book on her table that you noticed, where all of this just happened, right? And she's rightly a critic of it, I'm quite sure. But does she have the courage to say so, right? And that book is RFK.
No, don't say so. See if anybody else can tell us what it is.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, but there's a very interesting book on Bonnie's table there. If you've got it, you'll recognize it immediately. If you don't, image might be a bit too fuzzy, but I'll confirm when somebody sends it to me.
It's a you get a prize if you can tell us. First person to tell us gets a dinner on me. I'll make it for you.
They have to come all the way to Saxapor.
They do, yes.
And if they live in Sweden, we'll go out for. We can, yeah.
You'll fly me over, and I'll cook.
No.
That
Wasn't what I was going to say.
At your house.
I say,
What?
we can go out and have a. There's an excellent. I've already told you the answer, so you can't win anyway.
No, you'll fly me over to cook for them.
Okay.
at your farm.
Yeah.
All right, so that's a guarantee. We'll likely have to do that. If you're in
we'll
Europe,
have to negotiate
we'll meet you in
prices.
So yeah, that's great.
Okay, we are slowly getting there. We've got 2 more clips. Although this is the last, I would say. No, and that's not fair. The last one is also important. So let's move to the next clip, which is Bonnie. From my perspective, Bonnie's most interesting question.
Something like coming out of the piece of paper, look down, be like, oh, there's a bunch of things, but now I'm in a 3D world, right? Now, so this is what's interesting to me, and it's a question mark. I interpret the model of hierarchical complexity as mapping those orthogonal moves, but, and this could be really interesting, the model of hierarchical complexity could be at one dimension, and there could be an orthogonal move to the MHC. Let's just say, and the MHC, I'm just using that as an example. I mean, there are multiple models of hierarchical complexity, and so whatever we want to use as sort of our model. This is what it's rich though. It's just trying to think of like, okay. Right. If that's not the model that's mapping this recursive orthogonal move making, then we need a new map that does do that. And whatever does that, and it could be, then we have 2 axes where we're talking about complexity, but we're also talking about this insight pure abstraction move that you're talking about. But you see, there's a semantic confusion there, because then that's not really a releasing of complexity if you think about complexification as including that orthogonal move. Does that make sense? And so I'm kind of hung up on that.
I mean, I think what'll happen is after this conversation, I can feel you separating and so it makes sense as a question. Mm-hmm. But let me toggle to another story and then see. Sure. Because we'll get exhausted just trying to like capture this thing, okay, so for me, Dan Brown calls these, if you're in the tradition of, meditative training and Dzogchen, he calls this, you need a new vantage point. And so it's clear that's what Copernicus has. He just, the whole problem. So this is an insight practice. So here's, for example, here's a little insight practice question, right? So if I say to you, we have this problem with the environment, we're destroying it, okay? So let's ask this question. I say this to my students all the time. Are we in nature the way candy is in a box?
There's her wonderful question. Take it away, Jeff.
This is your Goethean moment, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Do you want me to go, or did you want to?
Yeah, no. I'm interested in you. You haven't fleshed out to me the Goethe move.
Okay.
So I'm interested in that.
So. Goethe. I'll bring back Goethe in a little bit and refer us back to chapter 4 or 5 in the Philosophy of Freedom, where we have this idea that the tree is outside me. Steiner says is ridiculous, and our first reaction is that's ridiculous what he's saying, but he's trying to guide our understanding of ourselves in a different way, because quite clearly, from a material physical perspective, if I identify completely with my own body, and so my body is just me and I just know my own processes, then whatever is not in my body is outside. But what is it that thinking actually does? It connects us with the world. So what appeared to be outside, when I am in the thinking space, what was outside me is then within me. I encompass it with my thinking. And this is the essential soul mood that Goethe has, that nature is one entire being. And we are we might experience ourselves, if we look at ourselves as purely like physical beings, it's like we might experience ourselves as being outside that. But when we actually begin to live into nature with our feeling and with our thinking, it is no longer separate from us. And so this is very tightly linked also to this question that Brendan was asking beforehand. It's like, how do we unify all of this complexity? It's like, how do we piece it together? How do we get to this, what was it, causal manifold? That is the essential nature of thinking. It is reconnecting us with her. But in her question, she's indicating and her description of what she actually thinks thinking is. Is there a problem with the sound? Now, can you hear me? I can't hear you. I think you're disconnected.
No, I'm connected.
Okay, I can hear you now.
I was on mute, but there was noise outside this room, and I was trying to locate.
Okay. Yeah. So what this question of being in nature, which she says we don't experience, that's exactly what does begin to happen once you become Goethean-like in your thinking, and specifically when we look at the thinking experience as we are guided through a self-understanding of what thinking is in relationship to the world. And she's asking for this new vantage point. So again, the new vantage point there, the paradigm shift that they're looking for is already there. Know the activity of thinking, and you will be in nature. And it's not like 1 minute you're in and 1 minute you're out, 1 minute you're in. It's a growing into nature that happens. So I think it's a really important question, but because I've heard her ask it in other contexts certainly without providing what seems like a clear answer to me, I perceive it as the really important question that she's genuinely asking and not arriving at a satisfactory answer yet.
Yeah, you're right on there. I think that the answer to her, because she's in a bit of a quandary herself about it.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Because it's like, well, we say that we're not, like in a candy box, but we act as if we are. We act, and that's true. She doesn't have a solution for that, for how to not act that way. You know what I mean? It's like, yes, I get it. I don't have a solution either necessarily right this second, and yet there is a solution, and the solution has to do with the organizing principle of reality, which we do when we think. We organize reality. And not only are we organizing it, we're creating new reality. Right? So we're participating in new reality as beings who are re-entering into the participatory environment. Yet we are separate. Because why? Because we experience ourselves as such. And if we don't accept that, if we go everything's one, man, everything's total. Stop thinking, man. Turn off, turn that off. It's just intellectual. We're giving up the responsibility that it takes to cross this divide. And it's, as I mentioned earlier, you really come away with, we're the Klocek's work to really feel the responsibility here, because we're in danger of becoming tethered to the material to such a full extent that we're in danger of losing what it is to be a human being altogether. And this is something we've described, in the previous couple of conversations, particularly in number 5 of 6 of Truth and Knowledge. Yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it, when you reflect this attachment to nature is like inherent in it is this separating force. But on the other side, science, it is, in a way, it is one way you could use to describe it is falling in love with nature. It's like, it's not just me I'm interested in the world around me, and I investigate it. That is healthy. Let's call it the first stage of love. But if it's poisoned by materialism, which is this, like, the ego strengthening part, and we can't move beyond that materialism, then we become this destructive force in nature that's like says nature is just there for me to do what I want with it, so that I can build a bomb, or I can buy a house, or I can have a nice car, whatever it is. It's just there to serve my own needs. Whereas again, once we continue the project of science of falling in love with the world, taking it beyond, it's like a mere materialism, so that we experience directly how nature lives in us and we live in nature. When that begins to dawn on us with conceptual clarity, this fundamentally changes our relationship. So it's like to ourselves and the world, as we fall more deeply in love with that within which we live.
Yeah, and you can see why the neo-Darwinian linear complexification schema is the one people glom onto, because they want to feel that they want to experience on some level the reality that there's a totality that we're part of, that there's a unity that we're part of, and that we just emerged out of it, and it has its own laws, and and we have nothing to do with those laws. It's just a mutation, which is where she goes next, right? Is that's the best that she has, is to fall back on mutation, right? And it's like a helpless move, unnecessarily helpless move from my point of view. It's understanding that we're destroying our environment, and that we don't know what's going to happen, but there's going to be a mutation, and then we'll be thinking differently somehow, or we'll have a different consciousness. And it'll
be a random mutation. It's like something that I don't have any agency in. So like the world will affect me. I'm being somewhat extreme here, but then I become the victim rather than the creator.
Right. Well, it's so ironic, because again, dichotomous. She's because of the dualism that she starts with, right? Is the dualism is the mutation, is these categorical abstractions, creates a me object reality. Like, I'm not real, fully real. My thinking isn't fully real. My concepts aren't fully real. The reality is out there, right? And that duality leads to inevitable recapitulation of that duality as dichotomy and self-contradiction. This is the argument I make about Douglas Murray's War in the West. It's the right term, wrong reasoning that associates what's going on. So she understands that we're self-destructive, but she doesn't know what to do about it, and so she falls back onto this mutation thing. And then on the other hand says, we're going toward freedom. Well, no, wait. Start there. We're starting with going toward freedom in order to mutate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's in order to metamorphose.
Yeah.
We're metamorphic beings, just like all of the rest of being, all of the rest of nature, all of the rest of existence. We're metamorphosing. The difference is we are participatory in free manner in that metamorphosis process.
I like magical idealism a lot more than mutation. It feels I've got agency there. I've definitely got agency there. Okay, going to launch into the last bit, and I'm sure you're going to want to talk about Fichte on this one, interjecting selves and all that stuff. Okay, let's take it away.
Getting to what you really want to talk about, but like spirituality and stuff. But we couldn't we'd just be talking like this, right? So we can talk about two things. One is, what is the self, and what are you aware of when you're aware that you're aware? And just to give you the punchline before the joke. So to me, what you're aware of when you're aware that you're aware is just that the body is aware. Now, one of the things that we know, for example, is that when you run a virtual perception in your mind, okay, so when I'm thinking with thoughts in my head, like using words, and maybe I'm practicing the script, well, what am I going to talk to? There's micro actions in your mouth, in your tongue, in your vocal cords that create the illusion that there's mental activity going on. But it's just your body. This is why Google or somebody, MIT, they could create this thing. And then when you went and did like, inner monologue, it can put the text on the thing, because every single mental activity is a sub-threshold muscular nervous action of the body. So this is a fierce naturalism, and it's not reductive. It's magic. It's a mystery how this can happen. Okay. Now, so I believe that what you're aware of, now, if you go into a certain meditation, you will start to be aware of the self you simulate. And you have to understand when you're in a simulation or not, versus that the fact that the body is aware. It's a transducer of information, and that's not your mind. In fact, you can be aware of your mind. What's aware of your mind? Your body. It's like, because your mind is muscles moving, and your body has sensory feedback when your muscles move. Okay, so it's completely holistic. All right, but I believe that the self is a pure abstraction. That the ego self is a psychological construct, but if you read Christopher Alexander, and after 4 volumes of looking at the world from an architect.
Okay, we won't read Christopher Alexander.
That's good. That's really good. Like she's on it there. I think it's hard to find fault with that description this time around. Listening to it, like if I bring everything else in and then I say this is what she means by this, then I might pull it apart. But I think it's good, except for the part where she says that the muscular movement and it's a wish fulfillment mentality, as far as I'm concerned. First of all, I don't know what she means by mind. I still don't know what she means by mind. She hasn't established what she means by mind. I suppose what she's talking about is that there's a piece of
She was saying every thought is a subconscious, it's like bodily process. That's what she's saying, isn't it? That was my interpretation of what she was saying. And
yes.
That's where I can't agree with her. I can see how it's based in truth. I'm not negating the fact that is part of the truth. Quite clearly, that is what science demonstrates. But she goes too far, because she says every thought is a manifestation of a subconscious bodily process. That is where you're extrapolating. So like certain amount of it's like good science, where you can just like do all these like a body bodies like MRI scannings, research to show how the body reactions precedes the thought activity, and they're using that to establish that it's the body that's thinking into the mind. And we don't have a problem with that from an anthroposophical. The body is definitely an integral part of mental representations, and it's everyday thinking. Nothing strange going on there. But to say that that is the sum total of human experience, that's where they're making a mistake, like with Big Bang, like with space-time fabric, that they're saying we've got a lot of evidence. Yeah, you have got a lot of evidence, but it's not the whole picture from our perspective. And so focusing on one concrete point is, what does Steiner say about what is going on in us when we read and understand the philosophy of thinking? We are beginning to think without our physical body. That's what he says. We're learning to think with our etheric body and not the physical body. We are doing something which is beyond the physical. And this is one of the reasons why it is so difficult to read, because we are. It's like going to the gym when you haven't trained. If you're not skilled at doing that, it takes us a lot of hard work to work that up. And you and I have experienced that very clearly in the last year and a half. But we've also seen the fruits of doing it. So this pure thinking, or concept, pure thinking, living thinking is another term that he uses. This is what they're missing in this description. They're saying it's a sum totality, and we're saying no, it's not. We have this thing called pure thinking, which is beyond the physical. There are other parts that I would like to. I would, if we've already been going 2.5 hours, so I don't want to launch into that. But there are problematic areas to do with which is cause and which is effect. There's which precedes the one or the other, because it's triggering consciousness and bodily reaction. But perhaps you'd like to wrap up with if there was anything else that springs to mind, because I know you were thinking in terms of Fichte and interjecting the self, because she makes this good, honest question: what is the self? Which has been a focus of the whole of this conversation as well. What is the self? For her, it's something that's not real, although the self can simulate the self from what's going on there. Yeah. So I babbled a little bit there, but
it's good. The mental construct thing is where she trips herself up. Like the self, there's the self that's the real self, and there's the self that's the mental construct.
Yeah,
right. Both are real. Both are true. It's true that there is a self that is non-material. So it doesn't exist in the mind that she's describing. Doesn't exist in an embodied mind. The potential self potentially involves the embodied mind, embodied the I in deepening incarnation into a physiological process, right? Our physiological process is a mirror of this process. Yes, they are a mirror. They are gestures. They are the words written on a page, but they're not the authorship.
Yeah.
They're not the creation. And the creation itself is emanating from, or emanating is a word that's thrown around right now, and I don't want to associate with it. It is engendered out of a spiritual process of which we are a part, which is what nature is, which is essentially spiritual, not material. Yeah. It's the motion, not the meat. And so there also is the presumption that we have a sensory motor arousal thing that they describe, right? This is just accepted in cognitive science, and first it's clean. This guy has already clarified this this narrative, and it's just that, it's a narrative. The reality has to do with perception of movement, and when we perceive movement, that is what they're calling a motor mind activity, and they're making an absolute unmediated claim that the neurology is the mind, essentially, that the neurological is the mind, and that is a materialistic claim. You don't want it to be. You say you're not reductive, but it's a materialistic claim. And if I would suggest, and we don't have a time to prove it here, but in conversation, I think we could get at this, and as an illustrative at least, that thinking arises out of a non-spiritual, a non-physical, non-material realm, and that the physiological processes are part and parcel of that spiritual realm. They're life processes in part. They're soul processes in part. And these soul process and life processes are real processes. It doesn't come down to matter, though it potentially can be inhabited in that way. And to me, this is where it's a thin line where there's a crossover into kind of, I wish that embodiment worked this way. But the work to get there is what's called for. And the work to get there has to do with these processes that we've been describing that come out of us as individuals incarnating into soul and physical bodies.
We have agency.
And then
we're not material puppets.
And then she places that self as the ground of our being, and so the ground of all being. And this is what Fichte does. And this is what excludes Fichte's relationship, or a profitable relationship with Fichte as relates to where you can get with that notion of the self, because it is already a self-limiting notion, because we're not engaged with this self that's existing by virtue of thinking. We're positing it, we're postulating it, and then it's the simulation again. Yes, we can self-simulate, and there's a move beyond self-simulation.
Exactly. There's a being doing that, and we are that being.
And we are that potential being that is at first the mental construct, but that becomes embodied itself, becomes inhabited, let's say, as the body, as the vessel for which this spiritual process occurs. That's really what I wanted to say.
Shall I press the button?
Press the button.
I just want to thank a wonderful way of rounding out there. Just anybody who's interested in like what Jeff just said, go and see the part 5. Part 5 of Truth and Science, where we dig like deeply into Fichte and his immense value and his limiting factors. It's like in terms of a true theory of epistemology.
Yes.
Okay. Right, pressing that button now.
Button pushing.